All right, so we are in Matthew 13:1. Matthew 13:1. And Jesus is just at the end of chapter 12, line we met. Jesus has just spoken about the special privilege of being his disciple. And that, remember there was his family came to try to, his family was embarrassed about what Jesus was doing. His family comes to him at the end of chapter 12 and tries to him while he's inside this house preaching. And Jesus says, my family are those who hear my word and do it. So he's talking about who his true disciples are, and his true disciples are his true family. Which doesn't mean that his family is not his disciple. He's just saying that the criteria for being Jesus's family is to listen to what he says and to do what he says. So then, so it's no coincidence that right after he said that, at the end of our last session, at the end of chapter 12, that he goes in now, third of 5 major speeches. Because remember, we were talking before about how Matthew has modeled the gospel after Moses.
Now they're frozen.
Yeah. We can't. Yeah.
I can try and send a text again, but
Yeah, it's frozen. There's something wrong with the system.
Yeah, I can't hear anything here either.
Yeah.
Now,
here it comes.
can you guys hear us now?
Yeah.
Yeah, you were frozen there for a
Okay.
bit. I'm texting
Okay.
Father.
Yeah. Okay.
Now we're good.
So the Greek word parabole is from the Old Testament, and it's translated in the Old Testament as Proverbs. So all the Proverbs of Solomon. For example, in 1 Kings 4:32, it says that King Solomon, spoke 3,000 proverbs or parables. So this was an ancient way of telling a story. It was a way to illustrate something. So it actually is related to parabolas. You guys remember back to math in high school, a parabola, a parabole is when you.
This is not going to be a good week.
No.
Throw
It's a good.
thing, parabole. So you throw something and it makes like a. You take an equation and you graph it out. So in other words, something that's an equation.
Has to be a loose wire.
Yeah.
You're illustrating it. And so a proverb parable is something. And it was common for Jewish rabbis to teach parables, to use these stories to illustrate their main points of their sermons. All right, so I say all this as we enter 13:1. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house. Remember, he was just in the house where his family approached, and he was teaching inside the house. On the same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the sea, meaning the Sea of Galilee, which is more of a lake. And great multitudes were gathered together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. So he goes into a boat. So, and if you've been to the Holy Land, the Sea of Galilee kind of is in a valley, right? So the slope come down into the Sea of Galilee. So you can see that there's this huge crowd around Jesus as he's standing on the shore. So he goes out into a boat a little bit of a distance, and then he's preaching into a slope, right, where the crowd can be. So it had better acoustics that way. They could hear him better. And it also gave him some distance from the people so that they could hear him and see him better. So, and he sat on the boat and they stood on the shore, which was the typical way that a Jewish teacher or rabbi would always sit. And this was true in general in most cultures, even in, when we talk about a professor who has a chair, it means that because in the old days in Europe in the Middle Ages, a professor had a chair because he was sat on the chair while he taught and the students stood. So this was common in the ancient world too. We do it the opposite way now. The speaker stands and everyone else sits. But I prefer, let's go back to the old way. So Jesus is assuming this position as this teacher. And in verse 3, it says, then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, behold, a sower went out to sow. So this is Jesus' most famous parable. Seed, so as we're about to read the story of the sower, it's important to note that seed was oftentimes in Palestine in the first century, they would broadcast the seed. That's actually the where we get the word broadcast is, in other words, they would throw seed all over the place. They would cast it broadly, throw it broadly. And that's broadcast, all the little packets of digital information are like seeds that are broadcast, that are thrown out into the airwaves. So they would throw out all these seeds, and they would, in the Palestine in the first century, it seems that the practice was that they would actually throw the seeds before they plowed. So they would throw the seeds all over the ground and then go and plow the seeds into the ground, rather than the more common, what we're used to, which is you plow first and then you insert the seeds. So that's how the parable ends up playing out, is because the sower has apparently thrown the seeds before he's plowed. So, and usually he would, in this case, it's probably by hand that he's throwing these seeds. But sometimes they would put it in a sack with a hole and they would attach it to an animal, and they would have the animal walk up and down the field and the seed would trickle out of the bag. But in this case, it looks like the sower is actually throwing it by hand. So that's all right. All right, so verse 4, here's the parable. And as he sowed, some seed fell by the wayside, and the birds came and devoured them. Some fell on stony places where they did not have much earth, and they immediately sprang up because they had no depth of earth. But when the sun was up, they were scorched, and because they had no root, they withered away. So much of the land in Palestine was rocky, with only a thin layer of topsoil on it. So if the sower hadn't plowed first, he wouldn't be aware that what he's throwing the seed on is actually very thin topsoil. It's actually very rocky. So he's throwing the seed onto this thin topsoil on top of rock. And for that reason, because it doesn't have much earth, it immediately springs up, but it has no depth. The roots can't take it because they're blocked by the rock. So when the sun comes up, they were withered away because they had no roots. And then he's going to explain the meaning of this in a little bit. And verse 7, and some of the seed fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them. So the thorns is a generic term for anything like brambles, thistles, nettles. And sometimes farmers would put such bushes of thorns or nettles on the boundaries of their property to keep animals and other people from coming into their field. So we might get the picture of a farmer who's casting seed near the edge of his property. 8. Some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up and choked them out. And these thistles or thorns could reach up to like a meter high, 3 feet high. Verse 8, but others' seeds fell on good ground and yielded a crop, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. All right, so what does it mean 100-fold or 60-fold or 30-fold? They're counting the number of seeds. That's how they counted the success of the harvest, was by how many seeds they got for the next harvest. So when they say 100-fold, they mean that if I had 10 seeds that I threw out and they multiplied 100-fold, it means that from 10 I got 1,000 out of the crop. So after I harvested the crop, I also set aside the seeds for the next year's crop, that you went from 10 to 1,000, right? So or 30 or 60-fold or 100-fold, 100 times. And it seems that in this period in Palestine, normally they would a crop would be somewhere but around 10-fold was considered good. But 30, 60, 100 were considered great, but they weren't considered necessarily like, these aren't miraculous numbers. They were actual numbers that actually could be achieved, right? So sometimes people did actually get 100-fold crop, but that was considered very, very good. All right, so this is what Jesus is talking about. So these are 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold are three outcomes. So he had three negative outcomes, one where the birds eat it, one where it falls on rocky soil, and one where it's choked out by thorns and thistles. And then he has three positive outcomes, 30-fold, 60-fold, and 100-fold. Let's see. Yeah, all right, and then he says in verse 9, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. So he's told this story, but it's not really clear. There's no explanation to the story. It's a parable. So 13:10 says, and the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? So the disciples normally asked teachers questions, and they normally did it away from crowds. You know, if they didn't understand something that their teacher said, they would go ask him in private, which is what they do here. And he answered them in verse 11, he answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. So what does he mean here? He's saying that it's going back to this theme from the end of chapter 12 about who's Jesus's true family. And his true family are his true disciples, those who listen to him and who hear him and do his word. So he's making this distinction between insiders and outsiders. So that's the distinction that's going to keep coming up over this chapter, is that there's this inside group of disciples who are committed to Jesus, and to them it has been given to understand what Jesus is saying. And St. John Chrysostom says, you know, when it talks about to him who has more will be given, and he who does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him. St. John Chrysostom says it's not so much God taking something away from them as it is their unreadiness to receive these gifts. So he's throwing out these seeds, he's throwing out the word of God, but some people haven't prepared themselves to receive it. And that's going to get into the interpretation of the parable of the sower, because in the parable of the sower, we're the soil. Right, the hearers are the soil, and the good soil is able to receive the seed and yield fruit. Right, so in the same way, if our soil is prepared, the soil of our heart is prepared to receive the word of God, then it results in us doing good works, being obedient to God, etc. These 30-fold or 60-fold or 100-fold crops that come out of us receiving the word in our heart. But for other people who haven't prepared their soil, who have thorns and thistles, who only have a thin top layer of soil, for those people, whatever they have will be taken away. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right, so the key.
Father Gregory,
Yeah.
What about his own disciples? I mean, he's already picked the disciples, because
Right.
he doesn't mean them at all, does he?
Well, he's saying, because you guys are insiders, because you have committed to be my disciple, to you will be given an understanding of what these parables mean. So he's going to, after the next few lines, he's going to give them an interpretation of the parable of the sower. He's going to tell them what it means, but he only tells them privately. He doesn't tell all the crowds, right?
They ask, don't they? They ask him, why do you speak in parables?
Right.
And it says it right there.
Yeah, why do you speak to them in parables? In other words, because it's not clear, it's confusing, it's vague. And sometimes you get the impression from Jesus's answers that he's doing it on purpose, that he's purposely being confusing. But that's not really what it's saying. What it's saying is that in order to understand Jesus, you have to be on the inside. You have, and I think this is true. I don't know, maybe Richie can testify to this, but there's, like when you come into the Orthodox Church, there's certain things that don't make sense from the outside. But once you become a member and once you start living the life, then they start to make sense. Does that ring true?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I think,
So I think that's,
I think having your heart prepared is as true too, because you may be seeking, and seeking, find the truths in the Orthodox faith that are right there for you, but unless you're seeking those truths, you don't understand them.
Yeah, and some of the fathers talk about that what Jesus is doing, for example, St. John Chrysostom says, when people have zeal and eagerness, God will give everything sufficient for their needs. But if they have zero level of responsiveness, God's gifts are blocked by the recipients themselves. Even what they seem to have is being taken away from them. So you have to have, and sometimes the fathers say that the purpose of the parables is to elicit this kind of further seeking from us, because they're not exactly clear. Our response is supposed to be to ask Jesus, what does this mean?
Mhm.
To inquire further, right? And not to just, all right.
I've done that.
And that
Uh,
the last section in 15 from the prophecy of Isaiah kind of
yeah,
explains everything, I think.
yeah. That's what we're gonna get to. So we're on, let's see, 13. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. And in them the prophecy of Isaiah is fulfilled, which says, hearing you will hear and shall not understand, and seeing you will see and not perceive. For the hearts of this people have grown dull, their ears are hard of hearing, and their eyes they have closed, lest they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, lest they should understand with their hearts and turn, so that I should heal them. All right, so this is for Matthew, this is a fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy, that their ears are hard of hearing and their eyes have closed, for the hearts of this people have grown dull. So in other words, they're no longer seeking for truth, right? They're just kind of going about their rituals, their daily customs, but they're not seeking deeper. They're not digging deeper when they hear something that's confusing. Does that make sense? All right. 16. But blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For assuredly I say to you that many prophets, and to hear what you hear, and to not hear it. So in other words, and this was a typical rhetorical device, or typical way of speaking, was to bless the people who heard or saw something. And in this case, Jesus is blessing those who hear and see him, right? Saying that the prophets and righteous men of the Old Testament desired to see and hear the Messiah, but they didn't get to. But now the disciples, those who have made a commitment to Jesus, they're actually seeing and hearing from the Messiah, which many people in the Old Testament yearned to hear, waited to hear.
Same thing he said when the apostles of John went and asked him if he really be Jesus. Well, he told them, but he tell him what
you see.
I have done and all that, and bless the ones that don't see it.
Yes. But oh yeah, blessed are those who believe, who don't
believe
see
and
and yet
see,
believe.
yeah.
Yeah,
And the same thing he said when the Thomas went,
yeah.
Yeah.
the same words he
Yeah.
used. So this is the same thing.
Yes.
Because if you follow it.
All right. 13, 18.
And it's hard to understand, well, excuse me. take your time, but,
No.
when I was young, this lady say she saw the idol, who's the idols in idol? See, I forget, I'm not like I used to be.
That's
Anyway, and she became to be a nun. We have the big over the church for that. I know they found his bones.
oh, a friend or
I know.
Dionysius.
You know, your
Nicholas-
mom did the picture for them.
Nicholas
Okay.
Raphael Nadini.
And they found the bones because the people from Turkey, they came and they killed everybody that was in the monastery. And after 500 years later, this lady saw a dream
Mitilini?
Mitilini.
Yeah, so Nicholas Raphael Nadini.
Raphael.
Aigos Rafael.
Raphael,
Yeah.
yeah, I was.
So, dan het is het about waar is mijn point?
So actually, I met the lady who had the dream.
Oh, okay, okay, now.
Yeah,
So, the lady became to be a nun.
yeah,
And she was drawing pictures and everything. And most of the people, they responded and they was nice to her. But most of the people, they're ugly. They was saying, you now came to be a nun, we know who you are, and now you came and we don't accept her as a
Yeah.
nun. So, and it's not easy. And all his life, it was not easy for the people to believe her, what she was saying, although she put people and they dig and they found the bones
Yeah.
as they dream was,
Mhm.
and they make a church and everything. And now she became a nun. I think she was 90 years old when she became nun.
Yeah. I think
90
you're-
years
yeah,
old when she began.
Yeah,
what was
Was
her
that
name?
in
What was her name?
Is that where that was in Mitilini? Would
Yeah,
that have-
Mitilini, yeah. Now it's a big monastery
Oh,
and
yes.
has a lot of people, nuns over there. But to begin with, it was not easy.
right.
And what was
And-
her name, Mahula?
Yeah, I forget her name
Eleni,
too.
Raphael, and
Well, Raphael,
The lady who became
Son.
a nun.
Yeah, that-
Yeah,
what's her name?
so I met a lady, I didn't meet her, but there were actually several people who had dreams about the location of these saints, and one
And
was.
she donate the property because
Yes.
it was in his property.
And one of them was a girl, a little girl at the time, and I met her when she was, an older woman. But she was one of the ones that had the dream that revealed where these saints had been buried 500 years before.
Wow.
Yeah,
my mother used to send money to them. So,
oh, yeah,
And she went there, she loved it.
yeah, it's we celebrate their feast day on the Tuesday after Pascha.
Right.
So every Tuesday after Pascha. Sure, that's a theme in this chapter too. Is that Jesus is dealing with the fact that some people don't accept him, hear him. They won't listen to him.
Yeah.
So why? Why is that in history that some people are going to be committed to him, and some people are family, some people will not be family, and that's just how it is.
Well,
We've
Now we've all-
lost them. There they are.
When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, then the wicked one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is he who receives seed by the wayside. But he who received the seed on stony places, meaning with that thin top layer of soil, this is he who hears the word and immediately receives it with joy. Yet he has no root in himself, but endures only for a while. For when tribulation or persecution arises because of the word, because of his commitment to Jesus, immediately he stumbles. So we see this too, and one of the things that we try to do as priests in the Orthodox Church is when we have catechumens who are coming in, we don't just immediately baptize them or chrismate them and welcome them into the church, but we want to prepare them so that they're not one of these cases where they receive they receive the church, they receive Christ with joy, but then as soon as inevitably tough times are going to come, and even persecution for being a Christian sometimes happens, even in our day. The question is, what are they gonna do then? Are they gonna fade away? Are they going to give up their commitment to Jesus? So, as priests, we want to make sure that they're rooted, that they have roots. And this is the beautiful thing that Orthodoxy gives us. Orthodoxy, I've heard many Protestants, like myself, former Protestants, say the same thing, that Orthodoxy gives us roots because it's so embedded in a whole way of life, right? It's not just some ideas that we assent to, but it's embedded in our whole way of life, like what we're doing now during Lent. We're fasting, we're praying more, etc. These give us roots. so that we can, so that when tough times come, we're not easily unrooted. Now he who receives seed among the thorns is he who hears the word, the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and he becomes unfruitful. So in other words, there's thorns and weeds growing up along with the wheat, and the weeds take all the nutrition, they take the sun, and they choke out the wheat. And the weeds are representing the cares of this world and the deceitfulness of riches. So the false sense of security that we get from our own wealth, this is what helps choke out the word of God. But he who receives seed on the good ground is he who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and produces, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30. So wealthy landowners controlled most of the rural land throughout the whole Roman Empire, including in Palestine in Jesus's time. And their estates, they had these huge estates that were worked either by free peasants or by slaves. But in practice, their lives were basically the same. The free peasants are slaves, except that slaves could be beaten and sold. But otherwise, their lives looked pretty similar, that they were working all day and had barely enough to survive day to day. So many of Jesus's peers may have been rural farmers on larger estates who would have readily understood the situation he described in the fields.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is it, so I've heard it said of this, the group of Jesus' family that came to him, that it's like Jude, James would
Right.
potentially have been among that group, that it was it's sort of after, Christ came to, I think, James after his resurrection.
Yes.
Is that kind of within Orthodox tradition, that's
Yeah.
the understanding?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's interesting in this context, because this parable is not so temporally locked. It could be in one scenario that you were among the thorns,
Right.
and like if you're in that category, you're not always in that category.
Yes. True. Definitely true. Even, yeah, so we see this even in the case of Jesus' own family, who at first think he's insane and then realize that and devote their lives, and are even, James is even martyred for Jesus.
Was he his brother?
Half brother.
Half-brother.
So, yeah, and they're gonna mention his brothers and sisters even. He had several brothers, and then it just says sisters. We don't know how many. So
There was real brothers or
half brothers. So according
Some
to
people they say half, and some people they say,
cousins,
no, they say Mary have children of
yeah,
them.
the Protestants and
Are Greek people. I'm talking about Trinity,
Yeah.
because that's only I know. I don't know the rest of it. But they believe, Mary never have
yes,
another child after Jesus.
yeah,
But here, when I came here, I hear people, and on the television, most of them,
yeah,
they say she after Jesus, she married and with his husband, and she have children, boys and girls. And she mentioned, the book says 4 men, 4 boys, and girls. It doesn't say how many girls. And one of them, the first one, believed him after his resurrection,
James,
but before he did not.
yes,
And he became to be the first in the church.
yes, the first
Yeah.
bishop of Jerusalem,
Yeah.
James.
So we don't know what to believe, but we believe Jesus is our God, and that's all it matters.
Well, what does the
The
Orthodox?
church says that, so there's a couple different views, and no one, I mean, nobody, no Christian anywhere that we have any record of before the year 1500 believed that Mary had other children.
I
Nobody.
never heard that.
That's what I say.
Nobody believed that. Only the Protestants came
I
about
never heard
when they
that.
had sola scriptura, and because it doesn't say the scripture, the Bible doesn't say that she didn't have other children. So they say, well, if that's what it says, then we just take it at literal face value when it says brothers and sisters, and so she must have had other children.
Yeah,
But no Christian ever believed that.
that's true. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But didn't they
Yeah.
always call
But
all of us brothers and sisters?
Mhm.
So,
Exactly. Yes.
you really don't know. if it
And
was-
just, and in the ancient world, we know, just like in Greece today, people call, not only do we call each other brothers and sisters, but, you call each other in the villages, Thea, Thea, right?
Everybody's there.
Everybody's Thea, which means aunt,
That's right.
Yeah.
right? So you call everybody your aunt. Well, it's not actually literally your aunt, or you say that so-and-so is my cousin. Well, they might not actually, they're related in some way, but you don't actually know if they're technically a cousin. It might be through marriage or something. So people don't use the words strictly literally and strictly technically. So what we think, what the Orthodox position is, the Eastern Christian tradition is that all these children are children of Joseph by his first marriage, and that he was an older man when
Yes.
Mary was
Yes.
given to him.
That's why,
And
He
that
had children,
his
yeah.
wife had died, and probably, and that age, many times women died in childbirth, and if she had at least 6 or 7 kids, she might have died in childbirth, but in any event, we say that she had died. Joseph was a widower. But some in the Western tradition, like Saint Jerome, say that the brothers of Jesus are cousins. Which could also be, because sometimes people would say a cousin they would call a brother. But the Orthodox tradition is that he was an older man, and that he was a widower, and these children were from his first marriage.
Here.
may I? Go ahead.
That perhaps,
Yes, we're gonna get this one,
Father,
yeah.
well, I was just gonna make a comment, and Neshua may be making it too. In our culture, our first cousins are like our brothers, and so
Right,
my brother and his first cousin called themselves brother instead of cousin. So
yeah,
uh,
yeah.
part of our
But
tradition.
there's also the other aspect of the culture, if I may, Father. If she had other children, Jesus would have not just handed her over to John to take care of her.
Yes.
She traveled
That's
with
true.
John.
Very
It
true.
would be shameful, actually, if
Yes.
her children, her own children, did not take care of their mother and father
Yes.
according to the law, because you honor your mother and father. Had they been her own children, it would have been against the law to not take care
Yes.
of their own mother.
Right,
That's
so
one
why
of
was,
the, that's a
Yeah,
legitimate issue there. Second of all, the fact that she remained with John, traveled to Ephesus and came back, I mean, that tells you that there were no family members trying to take care of her.
That's a good
Right.
That were her own flesh and blood. And so there's a lot to say about the tradition she came from, that her children were obligated, had they been her real children, obligated to take care of their mother.
right,
and then the further
yeah, that's a good argument.
translations, I think. Don't you think
Say-
after the split in the churches and all of the translations and all of that added to the confusion in interpretations, I think.
Yeah, but that's, and Ezra makes a great argument from the cross and the Gospel of John when he gives Mary to John to take care of. That would not have happened. I mean, especially for a pious Jew like Jesus and his disciples, that would not have happened if she actually had other children. And then there's just the argument that, imagine you're married and you had God. You had, I mean, would you then go on to have other, I mean, it doesn't sound right to me. I mean, and we as the Orthodox see in Ezekiel 44 talks about there's a gate. God says there's a gate into the Jerusalem temple that is to be closed and no one is to pass through it except the prince. And the prince was the name of the king of it, because God was the ultimate king. And so the king of Israel, the human king, was the prince, really. And only the prince shall enter in by this gate. And the Orthodox have always interpreted Mary enter by her, right?
Jesus.
Which is Jesus. So he's the true king of Israel.
Oh, my goodness.
All right. But here he goes to another parable, 13:24. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares, weeds, among the wheat and went his way. But when the grain had sprouted and produced a crop, then the tares also appeared. So the servants of the owner came and said to him, Sir, did you not sow good seeds in your field? How then does it have tares? Weeds. So, people in the ancient world in the Mediterranean often slept after lunchtime in the hottest part of the day, and of course at night. So he's referring to when it says, but while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares.
Sorry.
And sometimes ancient farmers feuded with each other, such to the extent that Roman law even had to outlaw the practice of sowing poisonous plants in a neighbor's field, right? So yeah, the most basic staple of the diet in the first century in Palestine was bread. So wheat was critical. But here's the interesting thing. So there was we're talking about wheat. There was also a poisonous weed, a kind of ryegrass known as darnel, which is called Lolium timulentum, is its technical term, and usually translated as tares, that looked like wheat in the early stages, but could only be distinguished from wheat when the ear appeared at the very end. So you actually couldn't tell the difference early on until it was ready to harvest. You couldn't tell what was wheat and what was this ryegrass that was a poisonous plant. So the servants asked the master, what happened? Why you planted good seed? And he says in 28, he said to them, an enemy has done this. The servants said to him, do you want us then to go up and gather them up? In other words, take out all the ryegrass, the tares? But he said, no, lest while you gather up the tares, you also uproot the wheat with them. In other words, because it's still early, they look the same. So if you go out there trying to root out the weeds, you might take up the wheat as well, right?
And Father, only after it was ready to be harvested, that the tares actually turned black on the top and the wheat did not. So you could see the black versus white. That's why when we were back in the Middle East, way back when I was a child, we had to still go through the wheat piece by piece, little piece at a time. As children, they would put us around the table to actually separate that little black seed from, because some of them would be mixed in the wheat. And so we had to pick those black seeds out of the corn, out of the golden color of the wheat.
Interesting, yeah. All right, so then the householder, the owner says in verse 30, let both grow together until the harvest. And at the time of harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather together the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn, right? So because you could only tell at the end what was what, he says, we're gonna wait till the harvest comes, wait till the end of this period. So the meaning of the parable is, according to the fathers, this judgment of separating the wheat from the tares will take place at the end of time, when Jesus comes again at the last judgment. So it goes to answering our question of, why does God allow evil people to continue, right? Why does God allow Hitler? Why does God allow Stalin? Why does God allow these evil people to continue? But in here it's saying, the wheat and the tares have to grow together until the end, and at the end God will judge, and some will be bundled up and thrown into the fire of hell, and some will be saved. All right, and then he goes into another parable, 13:31. Another parable he put forth to them, saying, the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, which indeed is the least of all the seeds. But when it is grown, it is greater than the herbs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. So the point of both of these parables is that the kingdom that Jesus is talking about, his kingdom, the kingdom of the Messiah, could come about from apparently obscure beginnings. So he's explaining why it is that, this Messiah figure that they'd all been waiting for appears as a peasant from Galilee, is circling and ministering up north in Galilee, which is the kind of like the backwoods of Israel. It explains why some people are rejecting Jesus. So that even the great things can come from small, humble beginnings, in other words. And so the mustard seed is technically, not the smallest of all seeds that Jesus's listeners would have known. The orchid seed is technically smaller. But the point of his story is that it's something that's very small that could grow into a large shrub. Around the Sea of Galilee, it could reach a mustard bush could reach a height of 10 feet and sometimes even 15 feet. Its usual height, though, was about 4 feet. And because it would grow anew each year, birds could not nest in it when they built nests in early spring. But the idea is that something very small can grow very large and very important. All right.
And he's talking about the kingdom of God, that it can really spread so huge that even though it starts with one word, sometimes people are saved with one word that they hear in a sermon that changes, and then all of a sudden they grow, and a whole church grows out of that one seed.
Yeah. And then you look at the humble beginnings of Jesus in Palestine, and then look how over the last 2,000 years, Christianity has over, 1 billion followers, and how much it's spread throughout the whole earth. His kingdom has spread from a very humble beginning. All right, then 1333, another parable he spoke to them. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven, which a woman took and hid in 3 measures of meal till it was all leavened. So leaven or yeast would be mixed with the meal, the grain, the wheat, and 3 measures of meal with 3 pecks of flour was roughly a bushel, and it was about, from our estimates, it seems like 3 measures of meal was about 50 pounds of flour, which is about all a woman could need on her own. Well, this is a big, and it could feed about 100 or more people. So the kingdom of God is like this leaven, which a woman took and hid in 50 pounds of flour till it was all leavened, so that she could feed 100 people. 1334. All these things Jesus spoke to the multitude in parables, and without a parable he did not speak to them, that it might be fulfilled which was spoken by the prophet, saying, I will open my mouth in parables, I will utter things kept secret from the foundation of the world. So Matthew here is citing Psalm 78, verse 2, where the psalmist describes his knowledge in traditional terms of Hebrew wisdom. And then he goes on in the rest of Psalm 78 to describe the content of his wisdom, which is the history of God's faithful saving acts and of his people's rebellion against him constantly. All right, 1336. Then Jesus sent the multitude away and went into the house, and his disciples came to him, saying, Explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. 1337. He answered and said to them, He who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, in other words, Jesus. The field is the world. The good seeds are the sons of the kingdom, but the tares are the sons of the wicked one, the evil one, Satan. The enemy who sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the reapers are the angels. Therefore, as the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of this age, when Jesus comes again in glory at the last judgment. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and those who practice lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. The word there, offend, is scandalizo, which means to put a stumbling block. So, in other words, it's anything that puts a stumbling block, makes people stumble on their way to Christ. Anything that is an obstacle for people coming to Christ, this will be removed. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. And then he goes into another parable in 44. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and hid. And for joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. So treasures, this sounds strange to us, but treasures were often buried for safekeeping in the ancient world. So the most likely circumstance envisioned in this parable is a peasant who, while working the field of a wealthy landowner, found a treasure buried in the field, but covered it again, lest the landowner claim it for himself. And then the peasant invested all his own resources into buying that field so that he could get the treasure. Stories of finding lost treasures naturally circulated among the poor. It's almost like, you know, a lottery story for us, you know, hearing about someone winning the lottery. So these were popular stories to hear about finding a treasure. They usually emphasize the wealthy outcome, but Jesus uses the story to stir his hearers to sacrifice whatever necessary for a treasure far greater than any on earth, right? So he is encouraging sacrifice of worldly possessions of money in order to possess that which is truly valuable, Jesus himself. All right, then another 145. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. So at this time, divers sought pearls in the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, the Indian Ocean, and some pearls imported by the rich could be worth the equivalent of millions of dollars. So a single pearl like the one he's talking about of great price could be worth in today's money, millions of dollars. So the Saint Hilary, one of the fathers of the church, Saint Hilary of Poitiers, says that the treasure hidden in the field points toward the incarnate Lord, who is found as a free gift. The preaching of the gospel has no strings attached. The power to use and own this treasure with the field, however, comes at a price, for heavenly riches are not possessed without earthly loss. So again, this idea with the pearl, this idea of sacrificing what you have in order to gain this one thing that's most valuable. 47, again, the kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet that was cast into the sea and gathered some of every kind, which when it was full, they drew to shore. And they sat down and gathered the good into vessels, but threw the bad away. All right, so there are different kinds of nets used for fishing. So the dragnet, the one that's talking about here, was much larger than the fishing nets that the disciples were using back at the beginning of the gospel when Jesus found them. The dragnets had floats on the top and sinkers, weights on the bottom. And they would usually have two boats. They would spread it out between two boats, let it drop all the way to the bottom, and then they would drag the net along the bottom and catch whatever they could. And once it was full, like it says here, they would draw it to shore, and then they would go through and see what was good and what was bad. 49, so it will be at the end of the age. The angels will come forth, separate the wicked from among the just, and cast them into the furnace of fire. There will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. So all of these parables, you can see certain themes develop, right? 51, Jesus said to them, "Have you understood all these things?" They said to him, "Yes, Lord." Then he said to them, "Therefore every scribe instructed concerning the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure things new and old." Now, this is kind of a confusing line. So some people say that Matthew may have been interested in that Matthew's disciples may have been scribes themselves who had become Christian. And so he's talking in particular to his own disciples who were scribes. But scribes who were especially conversant with the law naturally had the old treasure, right? And the message of the kingdom gave them something new, a new treasure. And so the image here that Jesus is talking about is like a householder, a wealthy owner, paying out old and new coins kept in a strong box hidden in his home. Yeah. So, things new and old. So he's saying that the scribes have the benefit of having the Old Testament and the benefit of having the new treasure of Jesus' teaching. Now it came to pass when Jesus had finished these parables that he departed from there. And this is the same word, teleo, to finish, which appears at the end of Matthew's 5 other major speeches by Jesus. It's the same. So he introduces them the same and he finishes them the same. So this is the conclusion of Jesus's 3rd major speech, which has been all about parables. Now 54. When he had come to his own country, he taught them in their synagogue so that they were astonished and said, Where did this man get this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And his brothers James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas? And his sisters, are they not all with us? So we talked about that they're children of Joseph's previous marriage. Where then did this man get all these things? So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his own country and in his own house. Now, he did not do many mighty works there because of their unbelief. Now, it's interesting, he didn't do many mighty works there. In other words, many miracles and healings. He did do some, it just says he didn't do many because of their unbelief, but it's not clear whether because of their unbelief, he decided not to do them, or because their unbelief, he was unable to do them. But obviously, it's not the second, it's the first, that because they were unbelieving, he calculated there's no point in wasting these signs on these people who are hard of heart. All right. So, and that's kind of like the story about the nun you were telling,
Yes.
she was not accepted in her own hometown.
Because they know who you are and everything, and it's hard to accept it.
Yeah,
So I understand what Jesus was going through. They saw him, they know him. He was, the carpenter's son. He was working with his father, and now he came out to tell us you are God.
yeah,
How can I accept that?
right.
Yeah, it's hard to accept it.
Oh, and when it says that, is this not the carpenter's son? So, the word there for carpenter is teknon, which means craftsman more than carpenters. So, and we always think about Jesus as the son of a carpenter, or that he himself was a carpenter. But technically, the word means more like craftsman. So it could mean that he worked with wood, but it could mean he worked with anything. It could have been stone, it could have been wood, etc. But it's interesting that Jesus, growing up in Nazareth, there was a town nearby called Sepphoris, which had been burned, and its surviving inhabitants enslaved. And so it's not surprising that Nazareth, there would be many craftsmen and carpenters who would work in the nearby town to rebuild it.
Isn't there tradition that Joseph worked building yokes or boxes?
I did hear that. Yeah, that's possible. Yeah.
It could be in the same tradition.
Yeah,
As an apprentice to Joseph.
right. Yeah, because typically when you said that someone was the son of a carpenter, it implied that they were the same trade, because your fathers taught their sons their trade.
And what were the yolks?
Yoke.
What
The
is
yokes
that, man?
That goes around.
that goes around the two oxen, the
Oh,
yoke that goes around the two
okay, yeah,
oxen, yeah.
okay.
to
Is that wood?
Keep them
Yeah,
together.
that's wood. I think
Yeah.
that's wood. It is wood, right?
It's wood, yeah.
Okay, I wasn't sure what the yolks were.
All right. Let's see, well, we'll just go a couple more minutes. All right, 14:1. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. All right, so who is this Herod? So that we don't get confused, Herod the Tetrarch is not Herod the Great, who was around at the time of Jesus's birth and who ordered the slaughter of all those 2 years and under. Herod the Great died within a couple years after Jesus was born. In fact, we think that Jesus was actually born somewhere around 6 to 4 BC. And that Herod the Great probably died around 4 BC. And so after Herod the Great died, the Romans split up his kingdom into several parts and gave parts to his 3 sons, Archelaus, Herod Antipas, which is the name of this one, and Philip. And they called them the Tetrarch. So technically, Tetrarch meant ruler of a fourth, but it had come to mean a ruler of a part. It doesn't necessarily have to be exactly a fourth. So he was called Herod the Tetrarch because he only ruled over a part. He ruled in Galilee and Perea, which was a narrow strip of land on the east side of the Jordan River, until about 39 AD, until after Jesus' death and resurrection. All right. So Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus, and Herod said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He is risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him." For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. All right, so what's going on here? So we know this story also from Josephus. Josephus was a Jew, not Christian, who lived around the time in the first century, around the time of Jesus and the apostles, and wrote a history of the Jewish people, especially the wars of the Jewish people. But Josephus mentions John the Baptist. And this is a testimony from the first century, not from a Christian, about the actual existence of John the Baptist, that he was a real figure. And Josephus also reports about Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch's affair with his sister-in-law Herodias. So what happened? So Herodias was married to Philip, Herod Antipas, Herod the Tetrarch's brother, but they each divorced their spouses in order to marry each other. So Herod had married his sister-in-law Herodias, which was against the Jewish law. And John was criticizing him and saying it is not lawful for you to have her. So it is not according to the Jewish law. This actually, Herod ended up offending his former father-in-law, who he divorced his first wife, and then offended her father, the Nabatean king, which ultimately led to a war. But anyway, the point here is that he's acting immorally and against the Jewish law. And it says in 5, and although he, Herod, wanted to put him, John, to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. So this takes place at a fortress on the east side of the Jordan River that I've got to visit, called Machaerus. And it was one of Herod's several palaces that he had throughout the Holy Land. And at this time in the Eastern Mediterranean, it was common for men and women to dine separately. So they had a big banquet, but men would be in one hall and women would be in the other hall. And part of the reason is because of this, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. The translation makes it sound pretty benign, but it's actually, what we should picture is that it was a very kind of seductive, provocative dance that she did, and something, not suitable for mixed company, right? So you have this further kind of sexual perversion that his stepdaughter and niece, Salome, ends up doing this provocative dance for him, right? So the whole thing is very weird and perverted. So Herodias, the mother, would not have actually witnessed this dance, right? So let's see.
So the mother did not witness the dance?
Because they were eating in separate halls. So the daughter came over and danced for the men.
Okay.
And therefore it says in verse 7, therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. So you can picture that he's drunk. And now he's been all excited about this dance, and so he boasts in front of everybody that I'll give you whatever you want. It's 14:8. So she, having been prompted by her mother, said, "Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter." And the king,
Father, excuse me if I may interrupt. It is,
Yeah.
I understood also that in that time, she was not his daughter, she was his niece, but that in those days, an uncle could actually marry his niece. It was lawful for him to marry his niece. And the fact that she danced before him and was willing to do that, he could have asked for her hand in marriage. In other words, that was an opening from her mother being pushed into it, that he could have her too if he wanted her. That was also allowed, that an uncle could marry his niece. And he was her uncle.
Yeah. Okay.
Never heard that.
All right. So she asked for John the Baptist's head on a platter, 14:9, and the king was sorry. Nevertheless, because he realized he was in a difficult position. He didn't want to kill John the Baptist because he was afraid of a revolt. He was afraid of the people taking up arms against him and protesting. But now he had promised this, and she asked for it, so he's sorry that he made that statement. Nevertheless, because of the oaths and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given to her. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison. And we think John was actually being held in a prison underneath this palace in Machaerus. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came, and she brought it to her mother. So you get the picture here that she's in another banquet hall. So they bring the head to her in the men's banquet hall, and she takes it and goes over to the women's banquet hall and presents the head.
John the Baptist is in Damascus, is actually tomb is in Damascus in what is now known as the mosque of the Umayyad Mosque, which actually I've been there, is actually a church that was converted into a mosque. It is exactly in the shape of a church, and in the middle of it is the tomb of John the Baptist.
Yeah, and then it says here in verse 12, then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. So you can see this reverence and respect even from this period for the bodies of these holy people. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up at 14:13. But actually, we won't be meeting for several weeks. We got 4 weeks. We'll meet again because next week I'll be away. Then we got Holy Week. Then we got Bright Week. Then we'll be back. All right. Thank you guys for being here.
Thank you,
Father.